Michel Houellebecq, The Impossibility of Being an Island by James Rowlins, University of Southern California. Michel Houellebecq has positioned himself as one of contemporary literature's foremost outsiders. Eschewing mainstream French literati, his own readership, critical reception, and the academy, he presents a striking example in his novels of the paradoxes of literary singularity. As Muriel Clément suggests in Welbeck Revisité, his work can be characterized as une île impossible or an impossible island. This paper will explore key elements of his troubled dialogue with the canon to questions of narrative aesthetics and humanist philosophy with a focus on the manifold influences from literary history that impact his prose. In particular, he borrows from the realist mode of expression exemplified in 19th century authors like Balzac, and a return to pre postmodern models and a brazen rupture with contemporary literary theory. In reading Welbeck as a reactionary figure, I will suggest that his island status relies on an archipelago of influence that links his work to contemporary debates in French literary circles, even as it attempts to isolate his writing from literary criticism since post structuralism. Although Welbeck's claim to island status can certainly be traced to the author himself, the literary press has been keen to fan the flames of a quixotic egotism by permitting him to offer extensive treatises on his own singularity. In an interview with Inrecuptible, the author asserts that, sur le plan littéraire, je ne me sens pas le fils de la génération qui m'a précédé, si bien que peu d'auteurs m'ont vraiment influencé. Weitzman 57. Welbeck nonetheless speaks extensively about his many literary influences in other interviews, calling into question the possibility of using his self criticism to explain authorial intent. These conflicting accounts of his literary production might be partially explained by his return to authors from previous generations in search of, in search of literary models that are more conducive to conveying his worldview. It is indeed those from earlier periods that seem to influence Welbeck most. Literary scholars seem often to express outright distaste for his self ascribed originality. According to Andrew Bennett, contemporary literary criticism tends to remain wary of authors who proclaim to be the fount, the origin of all meaning. In this regard, it remains faithful to a basic tenet of post structuralist criticism from the 1960s and 1970s, which focuses instead on the irreducible plurality identified by Barthes and his famous essay, The Death of the Author. Considering the text as a space where social discourses are combined, post structuralist criticism can, in its most rarefied form, treat the text like a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture. In this type of reading, the originality of the author derives from the ability to weave together these quotations in a new and meaningful way rather than to create isolated works and never before imagined concepts. In such a post structuralist context, the independent position that Welbeck attempts to adopt in relationship to literature appears virtually untenable. Even a perfunctory list of the writers and philosophers engaged directly by Welbeck's novels illustrates that his work remains inexhaustibly linked to a vast plurality of such centers of culture. For example, Welbeck makes approximate borrowings from Kantian moral theory and appropriates notions of positivist altruism from Auguste Comte. He frequently alludes to the literary aesthetics of Thomas Mann and Fyodor Dostoevsky, based upon his belief that the novel serves as un lieu naturel pour l'expression de débats et de déchirements politiques. Intervention 53. In his prose, Welbeck emulates Celine's acerbic nihilism, Camus' absurdist Écriture blanche, and Hemingway's reductive narratives. The laconic opening line of Platform distinctly echoes L'étranger, substituting Michel's father for Meursault's mother. Mon père est mort il y a un an. Its closing passages, where Michel has reached the end of his journey, are imbued with a flat and desolate nihilism which both emulates and exceeds that of Céline. Je m'imagine, je ne sais pourquoi, que je mourrai au milieu de la nuit. Mon appartement sera loué à un nouveau résident. On m'oubliera. On m'oubliera vite. Welbeck's 20th century influences indeed extend to predominantly Anglo Saxon genres, including science fiction in the tradition of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, dystopia as portrayed by Aldous Huxley, and a graphic brand of ennui exemplified by the work of Bret Easton Ellis. In addition to this range of literary influences, Welbeck appears obsessed with popular television. Last, Jack Abacassis makes close analogies between Les Particules Élémentaires and various American movies. Within a single narrative, it encapsulates the disturbing post 1968 chilling horror of A Clockwork Orange, the porno violence of 8 millimeters, the nihilism and despair of American Beauty, and the horrifying science fiction of The Matrix. All these threads are woven into a gripping psychological novel, a social critique, and a disturbing science fiction. Given these various cultural sources of inspiration, we can begin to envisage Welbeck as a master of pastiche, much as Quentin Tarantino draws his originality from the skill with which he conflates cinematic, literary, and pop references. He seems to derive his own singularity from many origins. Among the multitude of influences that have shaped the stylistic and aesthetic contours of the Welbeckian island, it is 19th century writings which resonate the loudest. The supreme air of confidence with which Welbeck pens his portraitures creates distinct echoes with realist and naturalist works. Much like them, his novels include occasionally witty, though more often brutal portraitures made fierce with cynicism. In addition, Welbeck borrows his most cited mantra from Schopenhauer, a 19th century German philosopher. La première et pratiquement la seule condition de mon style, c'est d'avoir quelque chose à dire. Likewise, he draws on Stendhal, who refuses a romantic beau style in favor of a streamlined plotline or procès verbal, which acts as a critical mirror held up to society's realities. As in each major literary movement in the 19th century, Welbeck organizes his poetic verse around themes of social and political importance, such as chômage, séjour club, répartition, consommation, and dernier rempart contre le libéralisme. To take only these examples from Le Sens du Combat. Although Welbeck's reductive narratives might prove most akin to 20th century literary styles, they can thus also be linked to these earlier sources. Several other 19th century writers offer similar points of comparison. For example, Welbeck's clever and subtle, yet ultimately pessimistic portrayal of hypocrisy parallels the problems of modernity that Flaubert highlights in The Conceit and Ennui of Madame Bovary. Indeed, an interesting analogy can be made between Emma Bovary and Valérie, the female protagonist of Platform, who remains essentially a banal and ordinary woman. Introduced as having un visage qu'on pouvait qualifier de modeste, ni belle, ni laide, à proprement parler. Valérie has a first verbal exchange with Michel that leads him to conclude that she was soumise en général, despite her zeal for extreme living. Furthermore, Welbeck demonstrates a concern for social outcasts who are not unlike the marginal characters in Émile Zola's Rougon Macquart. Welbeck's first novel is populated by manic depressive computer programmers, while his subsequent novels feature lecherous drug addicts, prostitutes, the sexually impaired, and, in La Possibilité du Nil, characters who are duped by a lugubrious cult leader. Yet, It is Honoré de Balzac's novels and novellas which arguably offer the most apt analogies to Welbeck's fiction in light of their robust and pugnacious social commentary. It is more than incidental that many of Balzac's most celebrated quotations figure in Welbeck's chapter prologues. For instance, Platform begins with these words: Plus sa vie est infâme, plus l'homme y tient. Elle est alors une protestation, une vengeance de tous les instants. Taken from Scène de la vie parisienne, this intertextual reference immediately anchors Welbeck's contemporary tale of alienation and revolt and Balzac's attack on injustices brought about by 19th century modernity. Indeed, many of Welbeck's own literary mottos, such as Insister sur la maladie, l'agonie, la laideur, and Soyez abject, vous serez vrai, Lire 24, are reminiscent of various celebrated citations from the master of realism, and that they likewise insist upon the paradoxical ways in which vulgarity serves as a means to ennoble characters. These aphoristic dictums point towards a common tonality in Welbeck's and Balzac's prose, which is borne about by similarities in their respective narrative aesthetics. First, Welbeck and Balzac both tend to introduce their characters by way of choice gambits, more often than not sordid in nature, followed by a steady stream of description and lastly narrative conjecture. In Le Père Goriot, for instance, Balzac presents Eugène de Rastignac as un de ces gens façonnés au travail par le malheur, qui se préparent une belle destinée en calculant déjà la portée de leurs études et les adaptant par avance aux mouvements futurs de la société pour être les premiers à la pressurer. Balzac insists on directing our attention to the most visible of details, namely attire. A characteristically unflattering appraisal of his character's physical appearance follows. Rastignac ordinarily wears une vieille redingote, un mauvais gilet, la méchante cravate noire flétrie, mal nouée de l'étudiant. The use of a capital letter on the word étudiant emphasizes here that Rastignac represents above all the archetype for a social category. His flaws enter into a mimetic relationship with the world outside the novel and symbolize a reality beyond the scope of his individual coming of age story. In similar fashion, Welbeck frequently invokes his character's physical and moral defects from the outset of his descriptions. In Extension du domaine de la lutte, for example, he introduces Tisserand through an extended representation of his attire. The strikingly unhandsome character wears un splendide costume au motif rouge, jaune et vert. On dirait un peu une tapisserie du Moyen Âge. Tout son habillement évoque le personnage du cadre commercial hyper dynamique, ne manquant pas d'humour. This portrait is immediately supplemented by the information that le problème de Raphaël Tisserand, le fondement de sa personnalité en fait, c'est qu'il est très laid. Tellement laid que son aspect rebute les femmes. Like Balzac, Welbeck dwells on physical minutiae and descriptive prose, then rapidly shifts to central flaws in character and narrative dilemmas, as though the material and moral world were directly linked. In their prosaic character assassinations, both authors convey a sense of disapproval, pity, and contempt towards their own protagonist. These writers use similar narrative conventions to portray secondary characters as well. These are indeed striking resemblances between the Maison Vauquer inhabitants from Le Père Goriot and Michel's travel companions and platform. Balzac devotes no fewer minutiae to the novel's lesser characters than to its main protagonist. La vieille demoiselle Michonneux, qui gardait sur ses yeux fatigués un crasseux abat-jour, cerclée par du fil d'archal qui aurait effarouché l'ange de la pitié. Quelle acide avait dépouillé cette créature de ses formes féminines. Elle devait avoir été jolie et bien faite. The rhetorical questioning of the subject is a device which only underlines the sense of authorial omniscience. Balzac uses nearly the wretched details, followed by the authorial conjecture. The narrator notes that Monsieur Poiret looks like une espèce de mécanique, la tête couverte d'une vieille casquette flasque, tenant à peine sa canne à pomme d'ivoire jaunie dans sa main. Dan asks quel travail avait pu le ratatiner ainsi. Rather than respond to this question, the narrator conjectures that some other livelihood must have wrecked them so, without actually specifying what type. This unshared knowledge leaves the narrator in a position of authority in relationship to the reader as well as the character. Although Welbeck's descriptions prove rather more neutral than Balzac's verbal extravagance, he also uses speculation as a narrative device. In his novels, the transition from omniscient narrator to a first person narrative creates a more subjective effect while continuing to make use of realist techniques. In Platform, the first of Michel's fellow tourists resembles a veteran politician, Antoine Weichter, jeune, si la chose est imaginable, who at first glance appears like Robin Hood avec quelque chose de suisse, de the narrator concludes. Pour tout dire, il ne ressemblait pas à grand-chose, mais il avait vraiment l'air d'un con. Michel speculates that the man and his spouse had in all probability reproduced, unlike the second couple. L'homme maigre, moustachu et nerveux, sa femme sèche et menue, qui donnait l'impression de n'avoir baisé depuis 30 ans. These attacks on the couple's mediocrity may be more sexual than Balzac's introductory passages, but they are no less acerbic. Like Michel and Valerie in Platform, Welbeck's other protagonists actively seek and, to different degrees, find salvation in the form of a stable, loving, heterosexual relationship. Their relentless belief in redemption through unity with the other cannot be denied, even if Michel is ultimately plunged into the same nihilistic despair that pervades most of Welbeck's novels. For instance, in the poem that Daniel writes to young Esther in La Possibilité du Nil, he not only speaks of a unity of soul and oneness of being achieved through love, but also implies that these peaceful qualities were part of a predestined fate. Au fond, j'ai toujours su que j'atteindrais la mort et que cela serait un peu avant ma mort. J'ai toujours eu confiance. Je n'ai pas renoncé. Bien avant ta présence, tu m'étais annoncé. This poem built around faith and a prophecy and sacrifice without renunciation clearly evokes a Christian vocabulary that reminds the reader of humanist ideals. The novel thus illustrates that the Elohimite's goal to achieve eternal life through cloning is profoundly nightmarish and dystopian. For all its hideousness, the present remains the primary space in which to forge hope for humanity. At the novel's denouement, when Marie 23 and Daniel 25 leave their solitary existence to seek out other neo humans in La Vie Réelle, their revolt also speaks of an innately human desire for community and companionship. Paradoxically, the ability to attain the proverbial utopian island lies in the rejection of seclusion. Thus, La Possibilité du Nil ultimately affirms the impossibility of being an island. Despite this importance of romantic love and collective hope, Welbeck also inherits a fascination with unlimited individualism, which he associates with materialism and promiscuity. As in Balzac, Zola, or Flaubert, the reader finds representations of modern selfhood, subjectivity, and ipseity. A unified I, able to confront the world, love, loss, and death. This solid foundation for a sense of self and his characters confirm that Welbeck attempts to return to the pre postmodern era. There is no mistaking his virulent antipathy for the world, forged by the 68 Heures, whose libertarian and anti-humanist values are systemically criticized, especially as incarnated by Bruno and Michel's mother Janine in Les Particules Élémentaires. In abandoning her children to live in a hippie commune in California, Janine appears irresponsible, reckless, and loathsome. Her own lifestyle choices seem to contribute to Bruno's social and sexual deficiencies, leading him to hurl insults at her in their final encounter as she lies on her deathbed. Tu n'es qu'une vieille pute. Tu mérites de crever. According to Jack Abacassis, Welbeck aims to explore a space of narcissistic monstrosity caused by extreme individualism and sexual permissiveness. His rupture with 1968 ethics and ethos has translated into a larger break with literary theory and practice associated with this era. Welbeck generally refuses to enter into dialogue with the work of his contemporaries or with ideas stemming from post structuralist schools of thought. However, a notable exception to this rule appears in Les Particules Élémentaires, in the fictional encounter between Philippe Solers and Bruno, a half brother to Michel who has failed as a writer. Bruno is surprised to receive Solers' admiration for his brutal poetry. Vous êtes réactionnaire, c'est bien. Tous les grands écrivains sont réactionnaires. Balzac, Flaubert, Baudelaire, Dostoïevski. Que des réactionnaires. Mais il faut baiser aussi, hein? Il faut partouzer, c'est important. It is interesting that the metaphor in this passage links writing and dialogue with other authors to sexual promiscuity. The informal verbs baiser, to have sex, and partouzer, to participate in an orgy, indeed suggest that the contemporary author who reacts against society also figuratively couples with or is in bed with the 19th century writers mentioned. The slurs that Welbeck depicts here shows no literary fidelity, since he also suggests that Bruno read Peggy and Sade, a poor fascist and a poor anarchist, respectively. After their encounter, Bruno believes that his collaboration with such a bastion of the postmodern literary establishment would be absurd. For his part, Solers renounces his decision to publish Bruno's work. Though the passage remains relatively light-hearted and leads to a collaborative dead end, its sarcasm carries more than a grain of seriousness. Welbeck shows an awareness that it would be impossible to maintain a hermetically sealed literary space not forced to interact with postmodernism. Although his characters failed to create a sustainable relationship, the novel acknowledges their coexistence and interaction, perhaps a flirtation. The case for dismissing Welbeck as deluded and his desire for literary isolationism is weakened by virtue of this textual encounter with Solers. His attempt to create islander status ultimately appears more like a reaction against critique informed by post structuralist theory than an unwillingness to engage with it. If it can be established, as James Leonard and Christine Wharton argue, that collaborational writing can be seen to advance the structuralist and post structuralist program for writing in general, Welbeck's fictional mockery of collaboration as writerly licentiousness might be read as a way to oppose such a program. Yet, Welbeck ironically uses such an antagonistic tone to affirm relationships throughout Enemy Public 2008, a volume of letters that he exchanged with Bernard-Henri Lévy. The two prominent figures agree that they have virtually nothing in common except that both rebel against French intelligentsia and therefore are subject to violent attack. To introduce this correspondence, the author chooses the first letter from Welbeck to Lévy, which emphasizes their difference. Tout comme on dit nous sépare, à l'exception d'un point fondamental, nous sommes l'un comme l'autre des individus assez méprisables. As this work demonstrates, Welbeck prefers collaborative practices that continue to respect the individuality of participants, if not to underscore their dissimilarities. Much like his correspondence with Lévy, novels by Welbeck use spatio-temporal distance as a guarantee to maintain the island status of his writing, even as it links it to other isolated texts. Just as letters are exchanged only between those distant from each other in space, his novels draw primarily on literary influences removed from his own time. Eager to be at the forefront of a new event in the French littéraire sphère, criticism devoted to Welbeck's novel in the mainstream and literary press often borders on the hyperbolic and sensational. An article in Le Nouvel Observateur referred to the novelist as the first literary star since Sartre. Many portray him as a radically innovative force amongst a wave of new writers, such as Valérie Despentes and Maurice Dantec. The magazine Littéraire, for instance, cites Welbeck as being at the forefront of La Relève des Avant-Gardes. A consensus prevails that posits his writings as radical and original, with even the Le Monde demurely commenting upon the new tendency in literature. An art press critic categorically states that his verse reads as if the history of poetry had never happened. Generally, there seems to be little perceived sense of contradiction in portraying Welbeck as a pioneering force for the future and as a heriter of tradition, according to mainstream media. Yet it is striking to observe the extent to which popular discourse on literature has become disconnected from literary criticism. Although critics develop sporadic comparisons between Welbeck's work and the literary canon, its reception seems confounded by his break with post 1968 literary practices. The accolades, new and original, so liberally attributed to zeitgeist defining works in the French press, have become rare achievements in academic criticism. While the caustic and socially mimetic prose published by Welbeck may have signaled a change of direction for French literature in the 1990s, being provocative and sensational is no longer tantamount to being singular or original, or even departing from cultural norms. If originality still exists in literary scholarship, then it continues to be understood in modernist terms as a creative endeavor that marks a significant departure from the norms of the cultural matrix. To a realist aesthetics, Welbeck instead creates an archipelago of island writings by drawing parallels between his own work and that of outstanding 19th century figures like Balzac. Ironically, Welbeck and literary academics alike remain faithful to modernist modes of thinking. They diverge to the degree in which they choose to retain different elements of its overarching paradigms in their search for new directions in postmodernity. Whereas Welbeck advocates maintaining a relatively stable sense of self and a humanist approach to questions of community, literary critics seek to destabilize identity and traditional social norms. Yet, Welbeck posits the quest for stability against a backdrop of instability, thereby recognizing concerns with linguistic and cultural slippage that have endured since post structuralism, while critics continue to deny his claims to originality for the very reasons that they identified with a now virtually impossible departure from cultural norms. The strongest case for dismissing his work's critical importance would be to contend that its study merely represents a return to literary concerns of the past. Welbeck is nevertheless far from alone in authoring contemporary works which draw heavily upon earlier aesthetic schools. Intertextual pastiche is indeed considered a predominant form of literary, artistic, and cinematic production of the present moment, and is often acclaimed as new and innovative. A failure to engage with such works therefore feeds into the island myth that Welbeck has sought to create, even while criticizing it. Moreover, it would be unreasonable to suggest that his contemporary novels attempt to uphold exactly the humanist worldviews that predominated toward the 19th century. His novels may flirt or even partouze with the narrative aesthetics and humanist philosophy of ages gone by, and yet, by the very nature of their recent publication, they cannot be divorced from the postmodern era. The question remains, why should intellectuals and literary critics take an interest in a work defined by its strong reactionary currents that blatantly disavow contemporary literary theory? Aside from Welbeck's savage attack on nearly all ideas connected with May 68 in the French intellectual establishment, there are admittedly other arguments for holding his work at bay from serious academic consideration. Notably, he unleashes provocative and often pernicious verbal assaults against various minority groups, women, and Islam. But if Welbeck uses antagonism as a means by which to forge new creative and social bonds, turning the poet maudit into one among many social outcasts, then these attacks might be more than an attempt to create publicity or to revolt against the establishment that outlived May 68. They might reflect very real frustrations felt by les exclus who recognize the impossibility of being an island.